BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays, I talk to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And in this episode, I will be looking at Michael Kidney as a Jack the Ripper suspect, continuing the discussions with Stan Russo's The Jack the Ripper Suspects, and looking at comments and questions from the Rippercast. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Jack the Ripper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Black Box Ned. Now, sometimes on Ripper Wednesday, you might hear me say something like, I'm going to introduce a suspect, and this person is a different type of Jack the Ripper suspect. Well, I don't think there is much more of a different type of Jack the Ripper suspect than Michael Kidney. Because as we're going to see very early on, Michael Kidney is someone who has been accused of one of Jack the Ripper's murders, but not all of them. And Michael Kidney is primarily a suspect in the murder of Liz Stride, who is widely regarded as Jack the Ripper's third victim. Of course, some people think that Jack the Ripper killed a lot more people than expected, and other people think that Jack the Ripper committed fewer crimes than some people expect. Liz Stride was murdered on September 30th of 1888. She was the first victim in what is called the double event. The second victim was Catherine Eddowes. Liz Stride was murdered at approximately 12:58 a.m. on September 30th, and then somebody may have interrupted the killer when he was operating. He could have hid in the shadows, waited for the coast to be clear, and then gone to Mitre Square and murdered Catherine Eddowes. But in this theory that we're going to explore today, an individual named Michael Kidney has been accused of murdering Liz Stride. Well, why would they accuse him of only murdering one Jack the Ripper victim and not the others? Michael Kidney is sometimes listed as the boyfriend of Liz Stride, a partner of Liz Stride, having a relationship with Liz Stride. And if you do some Googling, you might find sources very early on that are just going to flat out say that he was her pimp, and that, yes, indeed, she did work as a prostitute. And even Hallie Rubenhold, who wrote the book The Five, which is trying to write more or less a clearer history of the victims of Jack the Ripper, admits that Liz Stride worked as a prostitute. When I first learned about the book The Five, some people were asking me what I thought about it, and I said I haven't read it yet, and they said that, well, it's making the case that the women who were murdered by Jack the Ripper were not prostitutes. And that is only partly true. As I understand, what Hallie Rubenhold's thesis is that 3 of the 5 victims were not prostitutes, but Liz Stride and Mary Kelly were indeed sex workers. However, she does not believe that Liz Stride was working on the night of her murder. So I think that there is somewhat of an overlapping discussion that Hallie Rubenhold is having. Maybe I can do a presentation on The Five. The reason why I've been reluctant to discuss that book is simply because no matter what these women were doing, I do not believe that they deserve to be murdered. They didn't deserve to have their bodies mutilated by Jack the Ripper, and they didn't deserve anything that happened to them, no matter what their profession was. But with Liz Stride, she is maybe the most different victim among all of Jack the Ripper's crimes, because we have the murders of Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly, who were all mutilated, and Liz Stride was not mutilated. And I did my first Jack the Ripper episode in this current format on the murder of Liz Stride back in 2021, and I was just looking at these crimes and I was thinking, whoa, wait a second, how on earth, why do people think that this is the same killer? This really seemed like a different perpetrator to me. That was my initial response as an absolute, newcomer. Yes, I knew about Jack the Ripper, and I did one previous Black Box recording on the Ripper, but as a newcomer to seriously looking at the case, I thought that there was a very low chance that Liz Stride was killed by the same person who killed the other victims. That's what I said in 2021, and yes, I've definitely backtracked. And instead of a 10% chance, I decided to do an absolute reversal, and now I would say there's a 10% chance that she was not killed by the Ripper. But definitely the possibility exists. Well, if Jack the Ripper didn't murder Liz Stride on September 30th of 1888, then who did? Maybe it was a man named Michael Kidney. And let's have a look at some of the casebook info about him here. We have Michael Kidney was born in 1852, and he would have been 36 years old at the time of the Ripper murders, the Autumn of Terror in 1888. And even if he is not a suspect in all of the Jack the Ripper crimes, I think 36 years old is actually a totally reasonable age for the Ripper, because we're probably dealing with somebody early 30s, mid 30s, maybe 40 if your suspect is Charles Lechmere, but I tend to veer away from the suspects that are over 50 years old. 36 is reasonable, and so are suspects in their 20s. Let's look at the casebook description. Elizabeth Stride's lover at the time of her death, he worked as a waterside laborer and had been living at 36 Devonshire Street, Commercial Road. He had known Stride for about 3 years, and they had been living together for most of that time. Although at the inquest, he gave her age as between 36 and 38, suggesting that she looked younger than she actually was. And this is something that we're going to see very early on. Liz Stride was expected to have been in her 40s, but most likely she didn't tell the truth. And once again, I don't fault her for any of that stuff. She may have fibbed a little bit. She may have told some wild stories. She may have said that her husband died on a sinking ship, and then these things were untrue. But that doesn't mean that she deserved to be murdered, no matter what, whether it was by Michael Kidney or by the Whitechapel murderer. Michael Kidney's knowledge of her background was not too dissimilar from Charles Preston, including the false tale that her husband, John Stride, died on the sinking of a ship called the Princess Alice. Their relationship was obviously a stormy one, and he claimed that she often went absent and was drinking, despite his attempts to keep her in. He believed that her absences totaled about 5 months over the course of 3 years. It is possible that Kidney's relationship with Stride occasionally spilled over into violence, perhaps on the account of her behavior. On April 6 of 1887, she accused him of assault but failed to turn up for the hearing at the Thames Magistrate Court. In July of 1888, Kidney was sent down for 3 days for being drunk and disorderly and using obscene language. Kidney last saw Stride on Tuesday, September 25th of 1888 in Commercial Street as he went to work, and he was expecting to see her at home when he got back. Now, this is some stuff that I think is very important to keep in mind. They have a tumultuous relationship. They have a bad relationship. And if Michael Kidney is in this type of interaction with Stride, where sometimes he's referred to as her partner, her boyfriend, or her pimp, and could his violent tendencies have not escalated? Most of the time, you are supposed to suspect the boyfriend, right? So if his girlfriend ended up murdered, I think it's totally reasonable to suspect Michael Kidney, and that's not an arbitrary statement. That isn't just some type of superstition. When you actually look at true crime cases as a whole, all across the spectrum, there are reasons why they do look at the husband and the boyfriend, because they have a close personal relationship with the person, and you just heard there, this was a violent relationship. On October 1st of 1888, Michael Kidney turned up drunk at the Lehman police station, announcing that he had been the policeman on whose beat Stride's body had been found on, and he would have killed himself. He also boasted that he could catch the killer if he had the men at his disposal. On June 11th of 1889, he was admitted to the Whitechapel Workhouse Infirmary for syphilis, and on August 17th of 1889, he was admitted once again. Now, was he doing something with Liz Stride? Was he interacting with her? Did he have an altercation with her? He cut her throat? And what would be the explanation for the murder of Catherine Eddowes happening such a short time later? Could it all have been a coincidence? I mean, Liz Stride is killed in a different way. She is attacked in a different way. Her throat is cut, but she wasn't strangled first. I mean, I think that this is something that we can truly explore. And if you had approached me with this stuff 4 years ago, I would have been all for Michael Kidney as a suspect. But as of now, I have some doubts. It's a very small window of time for this to all be a coincidence, but I've definitely entertained that possibility in the past, and even when I started Ripper Wednesday in 2022, I was heavily open to the possibility of just the Stride murder and the Edos murder being coincidences. But there is a book out there that discusses this, and it's called The Jack the Ripper Suspect Guide by Christopher J. Morley. And there is a section about Michael Kidney in his Suspect Guide, which I would like to read for you right now. Michael Kidney. At the time of Liz Stride's murder, Michael Kidney said that he had not seen her for 5 days, though he was not concerned by her absence and still expected her home. A.P. Wolfe in the book Jack the Myth suggests that Stride was not a Ripper victim, but in fact murdered by Kidney during a drunken quarrel. Well, I think that if you were just somebody who was presented with these crimes, and you had to look at the similarities and differences, would you not suspect somebody like Michael Kidney, the boyfriend, of being the prime suspect? Let's say if Jack the Ripper was completely unknown to the equation, and a woman was found dead at Burner Street with her throat cut, and you didn't know about the other Whitechapel murders. Who would you look toward? How about the man in her life who was abusive toward her? Absolutely, you should suspect Michael Kidney. Now, that doesn't mean he did it. It means you should suspect him. On the night that Liz Stride was murdered, she was seen at 11 p.m. in the Bricklayer's Arms, behaving quite intimately in the company of a respectfully dressed man, kissing and hugging him, and was witnessed still with the same man 2 hours later. The intimacy and the ease of which Stride was with this man suggests that he was not a casual client. It would therefore be reasonable to assume that this man could have in fact been her lover, who perhaps may have been a married man. We know that she had taken care of her appearance that night, as she asked to borrow clothes from a fellow lodger. Later, when her body was found, she was clutching what appeared to be something of a small packet, which were French pastilles designed to freshen the breath of smokers and designed to disguise the smell of alcohol, again suggestive that she was making an effort for someone other than Michael Kidney. Well, I'm going to be very clear about something. I do not think that that person that she was hugging at the pub was Jack the Ripper. I do not think that that was the Ripper. I don't think the Ripper would have done something like that. I think that Jack the Ripper, if Liz Stride is a Ripper victim, was someone who perhaps approached her. He may have said words to her. He may have said something just to get her under control, and maybe he was spooked by a noise, and he cut her throat, and then hid in the shadows and ran away, the conventional narrative. Or if it is Michael Kidney, then he accosted her. It's like, hey, what's going on? Why are you hanging all over this guy? I mean, you're only supposed to have certain things in our arrangement. And then he's the one who did something to her. Although the throat cutting does seem like something that could be very excessive and not necessarily going through with the escalations in domestic violence, as opposed to some of the other possibilities that somebody would go for. But in terms of this person being Jack the Ripper in the pub, no, I don't think that was the Ripper. I think if that person had Liz Stride under his spell, and she's hugging him in the pub, and his whole plan was to murder her, he would have done it much more efficiently, much more quickly, and she wouldn't have been clinging to him for all that time. He would have made an excuse, lured her to a vulnerable place, and done the deed, and it would have all been done according to plan. I just do not think the Ripper spent that much time with the victims. Even Mary Kelly, it's most likely they just walked back to the room at Miller's Court, and he attacked her. And he probably didn't have any long, drawn-out, extended conversations where they're sitting at a pub, drinking and laughing and having a good time. As of now, I do not think the Ripper was like that. But as you see, I am definitely open to the possibilities. Let's keep going with Christopher Morley's book here. Liz Stride was seen at about 12:45 a.m. by Israel Schwartz being assaulted in the street by a man described as a 30-year-old, 5 feet 5 inches tall, with dark hair and a small brown mustache, broad-shouldered, wearing a cap with a peak. The man tried to pull her into the street, but instead he turned around and threw her to the ground on the footway. She screamed 3 times, but not very loudly. On the opposite side of the street stood a man lighting his pipe, who the man threw the woman to the ground, called out Lipsky. Well, now, it isn't, we don't necessarily know actually who said that. When this was first introduced to me, It's that this whole thing with Lipsky, which is a slur against Jewish people, was somebody said that. I mean, somebody said the word Lipsky. That's like my understanding of the story. But let's keep going here. And then, we have this person who is approximately 30 years old, 5 feet 5 inches tall. Michael Kidney was 36 years old, so he's a little bit older than this description here, just going by the time frame, or by the age. Now this sighting was at 12:45 by Israel Schwartz, and this is going to tie in very, very importantly to those discussion points that I said I was going to talk about at the beginning from Stan Russo, his book The Jack the Ripper Suspects and the Ripper Cast, because Stan Russo is an author, ripperologist, and he also appeared on the Rippercast, and he made a very interesting statement about the murder of Liz Stride. And what he said is it's totally acceptable for people to think that there was more than one killer, because he thought that the Ripper should have hypothetically had enough time to murder Liz Stride and mutilate her body and do all of those terrible ripping things like pulling out the intestines. Horrible, horrible stuff. But the Ripper should have had time before Louis Diemschutz arrived. Louis Diemschutz arrives at approximately 1 a.m., and Liz Stride was thought to have been murdered between 12:56 and 12:58 a.m. And this is why some people think that it wasn't even Diemschutz that interrupted the Ripper, and that it might be something different altogether. It could have been Israel Schwartz, it could have been somebody else, it could have just been a sound, it could have just been, as Stephen Hunter points out, that he thought that the area was too populated and he was never going to get away with it. Oh, somebody's surely going to come by here. So he just slit her throat, hid in the shadows, and went away, because he just judged the terrain. There's so many possibilities. And if you have one that makes sense to you, you can put your idea in the comment section down below. I would love to read it. Let me know what you think about anything that has been discussed so far in regards to Michael Kidney as a suspect in the murder of Liz Stride, or Jack the Ripper as a suspect in the murder of Liz Stride. But I see what Stan Russo is talking about. I mean, I see what he's saying, that the Ripper really would not have needed that much time to mutilate somebody. And if you're looking at this, maybe he's thinking that the Ripper would have been the person accosting Liz Stride at 12:45, and she doesn't die until 12:56. Well, that's like 11 minutes. Then he would have had enough time. But if you think that the Ripper only spent 2 minutes with Liz Stride, then no, he wouldn't have had enough time to perform his full Ripper mutilations. A lot of people think that the Ripper's activities would have taken around 8 minutes, that he would have, to talk to the woman, to strangle her, cut her throat, cut her body, and pull out her organs, maybe 8 minutes. So if you have any comments on the timelines, please let me know in the comment section down below. And there is a post about Michael Kidney on jacktheripper.org, courtesy of Richard Jones. I appreciate Richard for everything that he does for the Ripper case. And this one is called Elizabeth Stride's Partner. And Michael Kidney met Elizabeth Stride in 1885, and thereafter they had an on and off again relationship until her death. He gave evidence at the inquest into her death, and it must be said that his rambling testimony was, to say the least, slightly bizarre. And Richard has shared something from Lloyd's Weekly Newspaper, October 7th, 1888. Remember, the crime occurred on September 30th. And I'm actually just going to look down to the rambling section that Richard Jones was talking about here, because the coroner asked him, "When did you last see the deceased alive?" And he says, "On Tuesday week." On Tuesday week, that's exactly what it says. "I left her on friendly terms in Commercial Street as I was coming home from work between 9 and 10 o'clock. I got home an hour afterwards, and she had been in and gone out. I did not see her again until I saw the body in the mortuary. She left me through drink. She had done it before and come back. I treated her the same as I would a wife." Having given his evidence, the witness in somewhat of a mysterious manner complained that he had gone to the police at Lehman Street and asked to be allowed to have the assistance of a trained detective, as he could catch the murderer and they would have nothing to do with him. And then they asked him about that. They said, "Were you intoxicated?" And he said yes. Okay, though, so Michael Kidney could easily be telling the truth. And this story is also discussed in the book Jack the Ripper, an Encyclopedia by John J. Edelston. And what he has shared in that book is that he gives suspects a ratings of 0 to 5. 0 meaning either no or absolutely not, almost certainly not. And 5 is a suspect that deserves strong consideration. It's not like 5 out of 5 is perfectly the Ripper. I have a standalone episode called The Encyclopedia of Jack the Ripper Suspects if you'd like to hear more about John J. Edelston's book, and I invite you to check that one out. But as for his suspect ratings for Michael Kidney, he's like, what are the chances of Michael Kidney being Jack the Ripper? He says 0. What are the chances of Michael Kidney murdering Liz Stride but not the other victims? 1 out of 5. I completely admit that this stuff is suspicious. I completely admit that there are reasons to consider him as a suspect. I completely admit that he should have been looked at. But can I just offer a simple alternative? What if everything that Michael Kidney is saying is true? Yeah, I saw her and we parted ways, and she did this a lot. I'd known her for 3 years, and you heard that thing already, that I've said at least once, and that is, he estimated that it was perhaps about 5 months of time in their 3 years that she had not been with him. And that's not a continuous 5 months from what I've gathered. That sounds like she's going away for a little while, she comes back, she goes away for a little while, and she comes back, and he just thought it was normal for her. Could she have not just been out and about doing whatever she wanted? And then she met up with the wrong person, and the wrong person killed her, and Michael Kidney had nothing to do with it. That possibility does exist, and I have not heard anything in any of these descriptions that would truly indicate to me that Michael Kidney was responsible for the murder of Liz Stride. So I'm going to go with that one now. But let's look at the possibility of Liz Stride being killed by a different person and not Jack the Ripper. Maybe it was Michael Kidney, and maybe it was somebody else. And there is a segment that was written by Tom Westcott, who is the author of the books The Bank Holiday Murders and Ripper Confidential. And Tom Westcott has written something called Exonerating Michael Kidney. And the first thing that Tom Westcott wants to do is he wants to look at the differences between the Stride murder and the other Jack the Ripper murders. Number 1. Liz Stride was killed with a different knife. This is a difference between the Stride murder and the other murders. Well, this is something that's widely discussed by many people. I mean, even in Robert Graysmith's book, The Bell Tower, he talks about how Liz Stride was killed with a shorter, rounded, bladed knife. And then you also have people like Randy Williams, author of Sherlock Holmes and the Autumn of Terror, who say that she was killed with a longer knife, at least 3 inches longer than the knife that was used on the other victims. This has definitely been discussed, but not everyone is in complete agreement with that. And if I recall from when I did my episode on Dr. Thomas Bond's report, he stated that he more or less disagreed that it was the different hand and a different killer. He just said, I think that one person was responsible for all 5 murders. But let's look at Tom Westcott's next point. The wound to her neck was less severe than in the other cases. Okay, fair enough. I mean, that is a noticeable difference, but wouldn't that also suggest that this is somebody who panicked and made the split-second decision to have her murdered? The next one. She was killed at an earlier time than the other victims. I think it's really interesting that Tom Westcott brings this up because I've always thought that Annie Chapman was killed at a later time than the other victims. And it's like, is the glass half full or the glass half empty? Annie Chapman was killed closest to 6 a.m., which more or less would be the sun's practically going up on, what would that be, September 8th of 1888? And Liz Stride is killed at 12:58 a.m. That is earlier, because you have Polly Nichols at, 3:45, and then Mary Kelly is also murdered at some time during the early a.m. hours, maybe 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and that wild theory that she's killed much later on. But then you also have Catherine Eddowes, as we know, murdered, I want to say around sometime before or around 2 a.m. on the night of September 30th. So Liz Stride is killed earlier. And, I think he's going to get into another point right here on the list. But she's also the only victim that's killed on the other side of Whitechapel Road. So that's something that stands out in terms of geography. And the next one, the location was not one that Jack the Ripper would have chosen. And I'm just going to read out his lengthy explanation for this. I am surprised at how often I see this particular nugget brought forward. There are two different arguments, because that of Berners Street is off of Commercial Road and not Whitechapel Road, that it couldn't be Jack. Well, let's just be clear, is Jack the Ripper really only trying to commit crimes with Commercial Street and Whitechapel Road? Maybe Jack the Ripper was a serial killer and he just wanted to murder women who were in vulnerable places, and the entire island of Great Britain was suitable for him. He just happened to find them where he found them. I mean, I'm all for geographic profiling, but I don't think that is the strongest issue. The fact that Berners Street was only a mile from Hanbury Street and only a 10-minute walk from Mitre Square renders this argument moot. Yes, it's still somewhat in the vicinity, because that's the whole theory with Catherine Eddowes, that Liz Stride would have been murdered, but the killer really wanted to mutilate a woman, so Jack the Ripper would have gone out of the yard at Berners Street and made his way to Mitre Square. It's still in close proximity, no matter what side of Whitechapel Road it's on, no matter what side of no matter what proximity to Commercial Street it's on. I think that he could have done this. So the next point on this list is the man Israel Schwartz saw did not behave as the Ripper would have behaved. Okay, now that is something though that I do not particularly like to hear, and people are going to behave in different types of ways. I don't think the Ripper would have been sitting in a bar with Liz Stride for an extended period of time, because if his intention was to murder her, he wouldn't have put on a ruse that was that elaborate. It would be unnecessary for Jack the Ripper, somebody who has done this at least 2 times by attacking women in vulnerable places late at night. That would be something like, hey, come over here, or she's going to say, hey, are you looking for somebody? All right, well, let's go this way. Something that would be very, very short and to the point. So maybe I'm guilty of a little bit of hypocrisy there when I say that I don't think that the killer would have behaved like that. But at the same time, I think we're dealing with some very, very drastic issues. And I always, always want to be clear. It's possible for people to commit crimes in different ways, different crimes for different reasons. And then we have Liz Stride was not mutilated like the other victims. Okay, so then let's look at really what Tom Westcott is trying to say here, because he is someone who has definitely put a lot of nuance into his thinking. Anyone who has followed or even occasionally perused the numerous Stride threads that have appeared on Casebook will be quite familiar with the following reasons given by those who feel that Stride could not, or was most likely not, the work of the Ripper. As we've said, all of these things here, the geography, the method, the manner, the actions of the Ripper beforehand. But let's go here. The final and perhaps most convincing reason offered by non-canonicals for supposing that Stride was not a Ripper victim is that a ready-made murderer was already in the hand of the person Michael Kidney, her abusive, alcoholic, slave-driving, jealous boyfriend for whom she'd permanently separated only a few days prior to the murder. At least that is the picture often painted of him. Well, one person who definitely disagreed with that was Michael Kidney. I mean, what would he say? What would Michael Kidney say? Oh yeah, well, I'm the killer. Put me in jail. Send me to the gallows. No, but Michael Kidney said, yeah, she left, but I thought she was coming back. You heard that from his own words. Michael Kidney is reported as of being a 36-year-old man at the time of Liz Stride's murder, though he may have been as old as 39. Either way, he was much younger than the 45-year-old Liz Stride, who lied to both Kidney and her lodging mate, Charles Preston, about her age, saying she was 36 or 38. In fact, Liz Stride lied to everyone, as well as her friends and lovers, and to the courts of law. So, like I said, I don't blame her for any of that. I mean, this really is just something that is irrelevant to the murder to me. I mean, she's lying about where she was from. She's lying about them separating from her husband. So what? She did not deserve to be murdered, whether it was by Michael Kidney, Jack the Ripper, or somebody else. Let's look at another statement here from Tom Westcott. Some writers, such as Dave Yost, have taken Kidney's request for a strange young detective to follow the Liz Stride case to be a misprint, suggesting that it was supposed to be a strong detective. However, this is not the case, and although often missed by researchers, Kidney explained to the coroner why he specifically wanted to meet a strange detective, meaning locally unknown. And that this is when Kidney is going there saying that he wants a strange detective and he thinks that he can solve the case. Well, according to Tom Westcott, you just heard, that means it's somebody who's not familiar with the areas. Outside eyes have the best view. Let's look at Tom Westcott's section here on Michael Kidney, the suspect. While the notion that Stride was killed by someone other than Jack the Ripper goes as far back as the murder itself, the idea of Michael Kidney as the perpetrator did not start until 1993 and the publication of Jack the Myth, A New Look at the Ripper by A.P. Wolfe. And that's the book that you've heard about previously. Well, A.P. Wolfe is certainly not one of the most talented authors to write about the Ripper. He's also one of the most imaginative, and most myths about the Stride murder in general, and Michael Kidney in particular, are to be found within the pages of this book. And the text of the book has been valuable to peruse for casebook.org for years. It continues to have an influence on students of the case. There is no question but that Wolfe's theories about Stride have influenced a great many of books, some of which we will also consider. But to understand the genesis of the kidney theory, we first must start with the blundering error that first convinced A.P. Wolfe that Michael Kidney murdered Stride, and the following is an excerpt. The final evidence for Michael Kidney's guilt is so surprisingly obvious that it is difficult to believe that it has lain around for so many years. One day after the murder of Liz Stride, Michael Kidney arrived in a drunken condition at the Lehman police station. He demanded to speak with a strange detective, ranting that if he had been the constable in the area where the murder took place, he would have killed himself. This is a vital point because Kidney did this before the inquest, and opened long Liz Stride and her body had still not been identified. In other words, nobody knew who the victim was, and even later, after the inquest had opened, she was still being wrongly identified as Elizabeth Stokes. So then how did Kidney know the latest murder victim was his ex-girlfriend Liz Stride before she had been identified? Alright, well that's the challenge question. And I know we're getting to this late in the episode, and it seems like a lot of you will probably already have the answer. But let's look here at the follow-up from Tom Westcott. Tom Westcott writes that A.P. Wolfe is correct in only one point in the write-up of Michael Kidney. It would have indeed been absolute and unprecedented incompetence on the part of the police if a man had walked into their police station and berated them over a murder that had yet to be discovered and then was allowed to walk out freely. It would also be quite the anomaly if this person were to sit in a jury box in the inquest and tell the same tale without anyone catching on. Then to consider 105 years of solid research should follow up with a public confession. Of course, the truth is that Stride had been identified in the mortuary by many people, including Michael Kidney, prior to his drunken trip to the police station. And some of you might be noticing that there's a lot of different verbiage that was going on with those statements from Michael Kidney. I can solve the case. If I had been a constable, I would have solved the case. If I had been a constable, I would have been arrested. And it seemed like A.P. Wolfe took a variant of that and assumed that there was a variant of the words that could be placed that makes it sound like Michael Kidney was confessing. But Tom Westcott is calling BS on that. And I have to be on the side of Tom Westcott with that. That even though you have all of these differences between the Stride murder and the other murders, that doesn't mean that it was Michael Kidney. And this thing about how he said something about the Stride murder before she had been identified. Well, she had been identified. That makes so much more sense. And all of those things go in line. So maybe John J. Edelston was completely right about something when he said the chances of Michael Kidney being Jack the Ripper, 0. The chances of him murdering Liz Stride, 1. I simply think that maybe he was just the drunken ex-boyfriend who may have been a terrible person, he may have done some bad things, but that does not mean that he killed Liz Stride. I'm actually leaning toward the Ripper theory, and even after going through everything in this episode, you guys might be noticing something. You might have some doubts, but I really stand by my reversal in the past. I went from Liz Stride being a 10% victim to a 90% victim, meaning 10% chance of her being killed by the Ripper to a 90% chance of being killed by the Ripper, and that's not 100. As of now, I would say Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly were all murdered by Jack the Ripper. Liz Stride, I think there's a 90% chance, but I told you guys when I started Ripper Wednesday, I was of the mindset that it could have just been the timelines were just off by 15 minutes, and then one person murdered Liz Stride at Burner Street, one person murdered Catherine Eddowes at Mitre Square, and then a journalist wrote the Saucy Jackie postcard to try and fool everybody. What do you think about all of that? Please put your ideas in the comment section down below. And I would like to pick up with those discussion points that I was talking about from the Ripper cast. And I told you that Stan Russo is a regular panelist on there. He is the author of the book Jack the Ripper, The Suspects. And he was finally sharing some things about what he thinks in regards to the Ripper case. And I've talked to you guys a little bit about casebook.org in this episode. And there are lots of forums on the internet that talk about true crime cases, not only Jack the Ripper, but other true crime cases and unsolved mysteries as well. And Stan Russo brought up an interesting point that some people believe that the Jack the Ripper case cannot be solved to everyone's satisfaction. They believe that the case cannot be solved, period. So their ambition in following it is just to tear everybody else down. And I'm paraphrasing, but these are the ideas that were mentioned, and he's saying something to the effect of, they just want to tell everyone, no, you can't do it, we're never going to solve the case. And that is not helpful and not beneficial to other people when they're trying to do research. When someone proposes a suspect, they're just going to turn into a naysayer. They're just going to say something that is toxic and downtrodden, simply because they don't believe that the case can be solved to everyone's satisfaction. And they are using online discussion forums to just be a giant naysayer to everybody. And that is impractical. So on that note, I would like to ask you guys that as a challenge question. What do you think about that? Do you think that the Ripper case can be solved to everybody's satisfaction? I still want to say yes. 137 years later, I want to say yes. Soon it'll be 138 years later. Do you think the Ripper case can be solved to everyone's satisfaction? We might have breakthroughs in forensic science that will allow it. But I also want to point out that there are people who follow the Jack the Ripper case who think that it cannot be solved, but they are still following all of the developments, and they might not be pushing a suspect and saying that they have, solved the case themselves, but they're still following the news associated with it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that if that's what you choose to follow. I'm all about the freedom of the individual. But Stan Russo then went on to talk about his own suspects because he wrote a book called The Jack the Ripper Suspects. And I'm going to share something with you guys that is going to be as honest as possible. Some people are very good at talking about other suspects. They're very good at outlining the theories associated with other suspects. But sometimes, when they propose their own original observations about a case, they get very far out and wacky. And Stan Russo is talking about this connection between J.K. Stephen and Walter Sickert and how they did the murders together. And he also thinks that Francis Tumblety was involved, and Francis Tumblety is the person who supplied the half kidney. It was cut in half and mailed to George Lusk. And then, talking about how the letters are just created by this group, and it's all about embarrassing the Metropolitan Police and the royal family. And Montague John Druitt was chosen as a suspect to be a patsy and a fall guy because he resembled the prince. And I know that if you have followed anything associated with the Jack the Ripper case prior to this recording, you will have heard some of the names you recognize and some of these connections. And people are just sitting back and listening to this on the Rippercast, and they're saying, wait a second, it sounds like you're borrowing things from Stephen Knight's The Final Solution. And he's like, yeah. And then they're like, wait a second, you're also borrowing things from these other theories associated with Francis Tumblety. He's like, yeah, but I don't think he was Jack the Ripper. I think he was also a form of a patsy who supplied people with not only the kidney, but also the knives associated with the Ripper murders. And then once suspicion fell on him, he fled to America, and then nobody knew what to do next, and all of this stuff. What is that? What is that? I mean, am I going to turn into a giant naysayer if I'm going to challenge a theory like that? Because I don't remember where I first heard this, but it's a metaphor that I've used before on this channel, and that's like choosing two different cities on a map, and then drawing your own line. Like an American, you might have Chicago and Los Angeles, and if you were to just take a pen and just draw your own line from Chicago to Los Angeles, then you'd be like, all right, well, there are two real cities, and I made my own connection between them. If you're from the UK, maybe choose two cities like London and Blackpool. And if you were to draw a line on the map, on your own map, with your own pen in your own way, you could draw a line. But is that going to resemble a real road, a real driving path between these two cities? You've taken two real things that exist in the existential world and you've made your own connection between them. And with Stan Russo, his stuff about Walter Sickert and Francis Tumblety and J.K. Stephen and Montague John Druitt, all of these things are just taking the known suspects and establishing connections among them. And I will tell you firsthand that that's an impractical approach, because then you have the suspects that we know of. We have the crimes that we know of. Oh, well, let's just find a way to draw these lines among them and between them and unite them all in a way that makes sense to us, or makes sense to me, actually. Horribly impractical, because that is not evidence-based. That is conjecture-based. That is just speculation-based. Or that's just finding explanations about why fact A and fact B have to be connected. I do not think that that is a practical method for solving the Jack the Ripper case. But I've never done an episode on J.K. Stephen in the past, so I could do one on him for the future, if you guys are curious about any of that stuff. And if you want to challenge me on any of the methods that can be used to solve a true crime case, you can put them in the comments section down below. I would definitely look more toward things like physical evidence. I was critical of geographic profiling, but yes, geographic profiling, behavioral profiling, and looking at personal connections. Like Michael Kidney, I think, should have been investigated. I'm not convinced at all that he actually was the murderer of Liz Stride, but I will hear you guys out on anything. And let's look at more forensic evidence as opposed to just saying, here are the suspects, here are the crimes. Oh, I can find a way to fill the roles. That's it. It's just attributing the different roles of the Jack the Ripper case to people who have been associated with the Jack the Ripper case. Never mind hard evidence or anything like that. And I don't like this stuff about how, oh yeah, this person was in England before the crimes happened, and then they left England after the crime stopped. So were lots of people. Not enough. I mean, that's not enough. That is not hard evidence. Like matching up these timelines and so on. I will tell you firsthand from looking at the Zodiac Killer mystery, that is not a practical method. But let me know what you think about the Jack the Ripper case, and what do you think about any of the books or theories that have been discussed in this episode? What do you think about Michael Kidney as a suspect in the Stride murder? Do you think that he killed Liz Stride? Do you think that Tom Westcott is right when he says that all of this information that was said about Liz Stride being murdered was something that was done after the crime was widely known and that A.P. Wolf got it wrong? What do you think about any of these things? Please put your ideas in the comment section down below. You know where to write the show, blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned DeHaan. And there is also blackboxned88 on Instagram. And I use these pages to release shorts and reels Monday through Friday, and they mostly talk about true crime news, serial killers, but anything under the sun or in the darkness is fair game. And you can download this program for free as a pure podcast on the podcast circuit under the names Black Box True Crime or Black Box Podcast, and that includes Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and iHeartRadio, anywhere you get your podcasts. And you can support all of these efforts at buymeacoffee.com. buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And that's all for me now. And tomorrow is Thanksgiving here in the United States, so please tune in for a special Thanksgiving episode. And I'll see you guys then. Happy holidays to everyone who's listening to this as it's coming out live. And if you're listening to this next year in July, Happy Christmas in July. Until next time.